Hi, and welcome to Finovate TV, live at Finovate Fall 2017. My name is David Penn. I'm a research analyst with the Finovate Group, and joining me today is Pascal Bouvier. He is a fintech venture investor and thought leader. Thank you very much for spending a little time with us today.
Thank you, David. It's always a pleasure.
Excellent. We're going to talk a little bit about RegTech today. That's something that I know you've been had on your mind quite a bit. Tell us, what about RegTech excites you? What do you find interesting about the field?
One of my overall investment themes in the industry is that the financial services incumbents will live another day and compete, as opposed to having startups completely disintermediating them. And so from that perspective, anything that helps incumbents to be more efficient in an optimal way is important and interesting for me from an investment perspective. That's the answer number one. Answer number two, I think that we are seeing a third wave of investments and startups in fintech that by definition and by essence is addressing much more complex workflows and processes and much more complex problems that need to be solved, right? The first wave was direct to consumer, simple models, digitization of the front end close to the customer, and that lasted for 4, 5, 6 years. You had a second wave where you had a pivot of a lot of these direct-to-consumer models to B2B or B2B2C, where they were starting to sell to a bank or an insurance company or an asset manager. And now we're getting into what I term TechFin, where the technology component as well as the subject matter expertise is goes much deeper into the business or technology stack of a bank, for example, right? So let's look at only a bank. And so from that perspective, RegTech that addresses compliance issues, AML, KYC issues, reporting with regulators and the transactional relationship between a regulator and its ward, a bank, is smack in the middle of that TechFin theme. And I think it's a very interesting way of thinking about upgrading the capabilities of a bank, making it better at reporting on the things that a regulator wants, and ultimately allowing the market structure of a particular ecosystem or a particular asset class on which a regulator is looking at with a bank or a set of banks to be more resilient or healthier. And so these are the reasons why at this stage I think it's interesting to veer away from more direct-to-consumer and simple propositions and go into these aspects that make a bank tick from the inside.
Oh, interesting. Now you moderated a panel earlier today at Finovate Fall on RegTech and Innovation, was it?
Yeah, that's correct, yes. We had a gentleman who is an entrepreneur in residence at a large US bank. We had a service provider, consultant. We had the CEO and founder of a RegTech startup that is trying to sell to banks. And then last but not least, we had a person that is fairly high ranked within the OCC in the US. So representative of the actors in RegTech that will basically collaborate and work with one another, or not, to try and figure out what are the new solutions that can be applied to compliance, that can be applied to any specific aspect of the regulatory relation between a bank and its regulator, whether it be AML KYC, whether it be prudential regulation, whether it be on credit, and so on and so forth. And I was very surprised as to, and I tried to push them hard and play the devil's advocate and say, do we really need innovation in RegTech? I have a vested interest, right? Because I'm going to invest in these pieces of innovation that work. And I was surprised to find a regulator that was much more open to technology changes than I thought or expected that regulator to be. Much more aware of the systematic and systemic risks that a regulator faces with the banks that, and let's continue with the example of banks that are faced, as well as the intended and unintended consequences of the technologies that may be applied through RegTech solutions on a system in the aggregate or on one particular bank. And I have to admit, that, I was not expecting such forward-thinking views, and that's very interesting. Another point that, learning point from that panel was, that entrepreneur in residence that is looking at RegTech solutions for that large U.S. bank seemed to be much more autonomous in the way that he with his team was able to look at various solutions, do A/B testing, figure out which ones are more interesting or where they are going to get the biggest bang for the buck if they so implement it. And from there, I think that I'm getting a sense that when you talk to a lot of people about regulation, either you induce sleepiness or a general lack of interest.
Right.
But it's actually a fairly sexy area of the fintech space overall, and it's prime for disruption, and disruption in a way that is not going to disintermediate a bank, but disruption of like the way that one does business, either with a hiring 100 more people to address this particular workflow that needs to be reported on, or with obsolete technology. And so, I think the timing is right for investors such as myself to apply themselves, really understand, because the subject matter expertise is very, very different than in other areas of financial technology, of fintech in general, and also really understand the different geographies, right? What might work in the US, might not work in the EU, and again, might work in a different way in Southeast Asia, just to take a third geography. So, a lot to work with and to discover, and I'm quite convinced that out of that process of collaboration and cooperation between investors, creators of new solutions, and those that consume them, over the next 5 or 6 years, we will see meaningful traction from various startups that will grow, from the bottoms up,
Sure.
and get some commercial traction, because you have large banks that are very thirsty, that have much appetite to kind of upgrade themselves and finally be able to know exactly what their risk is, conveying that risk in a timely manner to their regulator in a way that allows the regulator to really understand exactly what happens within the four walls of that bank.
Right, very interesting. And you brought up a couple of points I wouldn't mind revisiting and underscoring, particularly with regard to relationship with regulators. But before I do, I did want to underscore that idea of regulation and innovation, and in the sense that you sort of alluded to, that we're dealing with one of the most attractive sounding concepts in technology, innovation, and one of the most boring, at least in terms of what people tend to think of it in terms of RegTech. And I really appreciated the way that you talked about how that, that's not so much the case, and how one can really help animate the other. And I was wondering if we could just revisit that just a little bit.
Yeah, so I would, as far as a regulator is concerned, right, I would make a distinction between a regulator needing to innovate for themselves,
right,
i.e. they're upgrading their capabilities, right, in the way that they produce the regulation that they do, and in the way that they allow for the consumption of the regulation that they produce to be done in a different way, maybe with machine learning, maybe with OCR, and so on and so forth, as well as the way they consume themselves, what is being sent back to them, right? So there's like a technology curve that the regulator has to go through to become a digital regulator.
Sure.
Right. I thoroughly believe in that. I think that's the way to go, because it will make them more effective and more efficient. Right. That's the one piece. The second piece is if one implies that a regulator is needed to participate in the innovation process itself, and plays quote unquote God and says, oh yeah, this looks like a good technology solution, or this looks like a bit, that's, first of all, I'm sure that pretty much every regulator is going to go, that's not our business, right? And second, even if it were, and they were to have a mandate from the legislator or the executive that they report to, I think that would be just a tad dangerous, right? Market solutions need to have market approaches with younger companies and entrepreneurs and creators, as well as service providers, as well as those that consume them, without some type of interference from people whose vocation is not to create new things, right? The vocation of a regulator is to make sure that you and I can sleep soundly at night, and the following morning, the money that is on our checking account is still in our checking account. Exactly. I'm being a bit glib, but that's, so I would modulate the innovation applied to a regulator as opposed to apply to a regulatory process. Sure. Now, having said that, I believe that some type of cooperation and some type of collaboration between a regulator and technologists and people that come with new solutions, as well as those that need those new solutions, is interesting in as much as if you do so upstream or upstream enough, it will inform the regulator on the rules that are already on the books, how they could be tweaked if need be, as well as inform them on the intended and maybe unintended consequences of a particular technology that may be applied, within a bank. So from that perspective, we take, for example, machine learning. And in the panel, we discussed this, right? If you create an algorithm that is a black box with some machine learning, you better educate the regulator, right, as to exactly what is being done. Sure. So that the regulator is able to understand what might be the consequences, right? So being part of that innovation process through education so that they know ahead what may happen, I think is important. Sure. One thing to tag onto that for them to opine on whether this is a good solution or not, that I don't think should be the case. So I want to make sure that there's this distinction and people really understand what innovation means when we apply to collaboration between a regulator, a startup, a service provider, and a bank.
Sure, no, excellent clarification. And just by hearing what you're saying, it seems to me that you were relatively optimistic about the capacity, the possibility of that collaborative model being more the case than sort of what we think more traditionally between regulators and institutions of it being more adversarial sort of relationship.
Yes, I think that what opened the floodgates, so to speak, and changed the paradigm and the thinking was what the UK regulator, the FCA, did now a year and a half ago when they came out with their own regulatory sandbox, which actually is, a series of processes that allow for testing and experimenting within the umbrella of the regulator, right? And so, since that has happened, we have seen in the market regulators from other countries adapting that original idea from the FCA for their particular country, for the DNA within that particular country, for the market structure and infrastructure of financial services in that particular country. I think it's a very interesting approach because, to your point, right, up until the proverbial yesterday, regulators were very much top-down.
Yes.
Okay. This is what we came up. We've been tasked with this, and so let's implement it. There lacked a bottoms-up approach, where you were more, closely connected to what was happening in innovation on the ground, and so on and so forth. And so adapting that bottoms up and being in that narrative and talking and being in that dialogue without being an influencer, again, of that dialogue, I think is very novel, very interesting, very creative, and probably will lead to, collaboration on an arm's length basis that I hope, and I'm optimistic, so yes, indeed, will lead to better outcomes. Yes.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for spending a little time with us on Finovate TV. It's really nice talking to you and hearing about some of these issues with regard to RegTech and innovation.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, you're very welcome. For Finovate and for Finovate TV, I'm David Penn. Thank you very much.